Reason, Truth, and History by Hilary Putnam quotes. Reason, Truth, and History by Hilary Putnam delves into the philosophical issues surrounding truth, rationality, and the nature of human understanding. Putnam challenges metaphysical realism, which posits that truth corresponds to a concept-independent reality, and instead introduces internal realism, which considers truth as related to what is rationally acceptable within a particular context. He addresses topics such as the brains-in-a-vat thought experiment to illustrate how deeply our perceptions of truth and reference are rooted in conceptual schemes. Throughout the book, Putnam argues for a perspective where truth is not an absolute correspondence, but is instead tied to our experiences in language, and he navigates between the extremes of subjectivism and objective absolutism. Quote 1. But to have the intention that anything, even private language, even the words Winston Churchill spoken in my mind and not out loud, should represent Churchill, I must have been able to think about Churchill in the first place. This quote emphasizes the necessity of pre-existing knowledge or awareness about a subject before one can intentionally represent or refer to it, highlighting a foundational aspect of representation in communication and thought. This establishes that representation is not merely about the physical or accidental resemblance, but fundamentally about the intention and mental engagement with the subject of representation. Quote 2. The mere fact that the picture bears a resemblance to Churchill does not make it into a real picture, nor does it make it a representation of Churchill. This quote challenges the common misconception that physical resemblance is sufficient to confer representational status. It argues that intention and awareness are critical, underscoring that representation is more than superficial similarity and involves a deeper cognitive and contextual engagement. Quote 3. The argument is simple. What we said about the ant's curve applies to any physical object. No physical object can, in itself, refer to one thing rather than to another. Nevertheless, thoughts in the mind obviously do succeed in referring to one thing rather than another. This quote addresses the distinction between physical objects and mental representations, pointing out that while physical objects do not inherently possess referential qualities, thoughts can distinctly refer or relate to specific entities or ideas. This distinction underlines the unique properties of mental processes in how they connect with the world. Quote 4. If there were a person who memorized those words and said them in his mind without understanding them, then they would not refer to anything when thought in the mind either. The quote delves into the nature of understanding and its role in meaning. It suggests that mere memorization without comprehension does not fulfill the criteria for meaningful mental representation. This illustrates the complexity of mental processes and the importance of cognitive involvement for generating meaningful representations. Quote 5. But the fact that they are conscious and intelligent does not mean that their words refer to what our words refer. This quote highlights a fundamental issue in philosophy of mind and language. Consciousness and intelligence do not guarantee that verbal expressions correspond accurately to the external world. This insight challenges the assumption that a conscious mind must inherently have a correct understanding or representation of its surroundings. Quote 6. Their images, words, etc., are qualitatively identical with images, words, etc., which do represent trees in our world. But we have already seen that qualitative similarity to something which represents an object does not make a thing a representation all by itself. This statement delves into the concept of representation, stressing that mere qualitative similarity between a subject's perception and an external object's representation does not suffice for actual representation. It underscores the complexity of mental representations, suggesting that additional factors beyond mere appearance are necessary for true representation. Quote 7. If these brains think about, refer to, represent trees, real trees, outside the vat, then it must be because of the way the program connects the system of language to nonverbal input and outputs. This quote explores how the connection between language systems and sensory inputs and outputs influences our capacity to refer to and think about external objects. It points out that without these crucial connections, thoughts and languages remain internal and detached from the external reality, highlighting the importance of interaction between cognitive and sensory systems for meaningful external referencing. Quote 8. The whole system of sense data, motor signals to the efferent endings, and verbally or conceptually mediated thought connected by language entry rules to the sense data as inputs and by language exit rules to the motor signals as outputs, has no more connection to trees than the ant's curve has to Winston Churchill. Here, the focus is on the intricate system of inputs and outputs that govern sensory experiences and responses, clarifying that without the correct interpretative framework, these systems do not inherently connect to their supposed external reference. The comparison with the ant's curve and Winston Churchill vividly illustrates how disconnected internal processes can be from the entities they are thought to represent, even when functioning perfectly from a mechanical standpoint. Quote 9. The reference is different because the stuff is different. The mental state by itself, in isolation from the whole situation, does not fix the reference. This statement emphasizes that the reference of words is not fixed by mental states alone, but by the actual external substances they aim to describe. This reinforces the idea that language and its meanings are deeply interconnected with the physical world, not just constructed in the mind. Quote 10. If we agree that water does not change meaning in either language, when experts make such discoveries as water is H2O or water is a mixture of two liquids, and that water in its ordinary earth meaning and reference does not include mixtures of alcohol and water, then we must say that expert knowledge is not what accounts for the difference in the meaning of the word water on Earth and on twin Earth. This quote argues against the notion that scientific discoveries about the composition of substances like water alter the basic meaning of the word water. It asserts that even significant scientific findings do not change the fundamental linguistic reference of terms, emphasizing a separation between scientific knowledge and everyday language, meaning. Quote 11. Why is it surprising that the brain-in-a-vat hypothesis turns out to be incoherent? The reason is that we are inclined to think that what goes on inside our heads must determine what we mean and what our words refer to. But it is not hard to see that this is wrong. This quote challenges the intuitive belief that our internal mental state solely determines the meaning and reference of our words. It points out a common misconception in understanding how language and meaning work, suggesting that external factors play a crucial role in defining linguistic references and not just our internal perceptions or intentions. Quote 12. What goes on inside people's heads does not fix the reference of their terms. This quote succinctly summarizes the argument that mental states alone cannot determine the reference of linguistic terms. It supports the broader philosophical claim that understanding and meaning are not just internal cognitive functions, but are also shaped by our interaction with the external world. Quote 13. The problems we have been discussing naturally give rise to two philosophical points of view, or two philosophical temperaments, as I called them in the introduction. It is with these points of view and with their consequences for just about every issue in philosophy that I shall be concerned. The question of brains in a vat would not be of interest except as a sort of logical paradox if it were not for the sharp way in which it brings out the difference between these philosophical perspectives. This quote introduces the significant philosophical debate influenced by the brains-in-a-vat thought experiment, which serves as a critical illustrative tool for distinguishing between two major philosophical viewpoints, metaphysical realism and internalism. The significance of this thought experiment lies in its ability to starkly contrast these perspectives, influencing broad philosophical discussions on reality, perception, and knowledge. Quote 14. One of these perspectives is the perspective of metaphysical realism. On this perspective, the world consists of some fixed totality of mind-independent objects. there is exactly one true and complete description of the way the world is. Truth involves some sort of correspondence relation between words or thought signs and external things and sets of things. This quote lays out the basics of metaphysical realism, where truth is seen as a correspondence between our language or thoughts and an objective, external reality that exists independently of our perceptions or beliefs. This view posits a single, definitive way that the world truly is, irrespective of human perspective or interpretation. Quote 15. The perspective I shall defend has no unambiguous name. It is a late arrival in the history of philosophy, and even today it keeps being confused with other points of view of a quite different sort. I shall refer to it as the internalist perspective, because it is characteristic of this view to hold that what objects does the world consist of is a question that it only makes sense to ask within a theory or description. In this quote, the internalist perspective is explained as a philosophical view where the composition of the world is understood only through the frameworks of theories or descriptions we construct. Unlike metaphysical realism, internalism posits that our understanding of objects and the world is inseparable from our conceptual schemas and language, emphasizing that truth and reality are concept-dependent. Quote 16. Internalist philosophers dismiss the brain-in-a-vat hypothesis. For us, the brain-in-a-vat world is only a story, a mere linguistic construction, and not a possible world at all. This quote reflects the internalist rejection of the brain-in-a-vat scenario as a genuine possibility. From this perspective, such a scenario is considered merely a construct of language and thought, lacking the status of an actual possible world. This stance highlights the internalist view that reality is fundamentally intertwined with human conceptualization and cannot exist independently of it. Quote 17. At the same time, talk of ordinary empirical objects is not talk of things in themselves, but only talk of things for us. This quote encapsulates Kant's distinction between the noumenal, things in themselves, which are beyond our sensory experience, and the phenomenal, things as they appear to us through our senses. It suggests that our discussions and understanding of everyday objects are rooted in our perceptions and conceptual frameworks, rather than direct interactions with objects as they exist independently of human perception. Quote 18. The really subtle point is that Kant regards all of these points as applying to sensations, objects of internal sense, as well as to external objects. This statement highlights Kant's philosophical approach that internal sensations and external objects are both interpreted through the same cognitive frameworks, challenging the direct realism view that external objects are perceived as they truly are. Kant argues that both types of experiences are subject to the same conditions of human perception and understanding, blurring the traditional distinction between internal and external experiences in terms of their epistemological treatment. Quote 19. Whether the sensations I have at different times that I classify as sensations of red are all really, nominally, similar is a question that makes no sense. If they appear to be similar, then they are similar for me. Here, the quote delves into the subjective nature of human perception as described by Kant, where the consistency of sensory experiences, like color, across time doesn't necessarily reflect any inherent similarity of those experiences outside of our perception. Kant dismisses the notion of absolute, objective similarity independent of the observer, suggesting instead that similarity is always contextual and relative to individual perception and cognition. Quote 20. Kant says again and again, and in different words, that the objects of inner sense are not transcendentally real, noumenal, that they are transcendentally ideal, things for us, and that they are no more and no less directly knowable than so-called external objects. This quote reinforces Kant's idea that our knowledge of internal sensations is processed in the same way as our knowledge of the external world. Both are constructed within the confines of our cognitive and perceptual systems, making them equally real or ideal, depending on the philosophical perspective. This equivalency challenges the idea that internal experiences have a more direct or authentic connection to reality than perceptions of the external world. Quote 21. In the 17th century, the great philosophers Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz all realized that there was a serious problem about the relation of mind to material body. This quote sets the stage for the historical context in which the mind-body problem became prominent in philosophical discourse. It highlights how the rise of modern physics intensified philosophical inquiries into how the immaterial mind relates to the physical body, setting a foundational question that persists in both philosophy and cognitive science. Quote 22. It seemed to these thinkers that mental events could do one of two things. 1. They could parallel physical events, e.g., events in the brain. 2. They could interact with physical events. Here, the quote outlines the foundational views of mental and physical event correlation, parallelism, and interactionism. These philosophical approaches attempt to explain how mental processes, like thoughts and sensations, correspond with or affect physical processes in the brain, reflecting early attempts to integrate mental experiences with observable physical phenomena. Quote 23. The most naive version of the interactionist view conceives of the mind as a sort of ghost, capable of inhabiting different bodies. This statement critiques a simplistic interpretation of interactionism, where the mind is seen as a separate, ghost-like entity that can exist independently of or move between bodies. It points to a rudimentary understanding of the mind-body connection that falls short of explaining the complex interactions between mental states and physical brain processes. Quote 24. The parallelist alternative is also very strange. What makes the mental event accompany the brain event? The quote challenges the idea of parallelism, where mental and physical events occur in coordination without directly influencing each other. It questions the mechanism by which these perfectly synchronized occurrences could exist, pushing philosophical inquiry towards deeper explanations of how mind and brain might be more integrally connected than mere coincidental alignment. Quote 25. The problem is that if one takes this metaphysical realist standpoint, then there are many more possibilities than people are wont to consider. This quote captures the essence of the philosophical challenge posed by adopting a metaphysical realist view, particularly in the context of mind-body identity theories. It suggests that such a stance opens up a myriad of conceivable scenarios regarding the nature of consciousness and sensation, far beyond what traditional views might allow, underscoring the complexity and breadth of possible interpretations within philosophical discourse. Quote 26. Let us make the assumption that it is, for the moment. Now, let us suppose we can cut off the process that produces the record in mentalese, or at least cut off the input to the speech center. This quote delves into a hypothetical scenario to explore the implications of severing the connection between cognitive processing, mentalese, and linguistic expression, speech center. It challenges the conventional understanding of how sensory experiences are processed and articulated, prompting a re-evaluation of the foundational mechanisms that link perception to communication. Quote 27. Now, by one criterion we employ to decide whether or not someone has a sensation, the criterion of sincere verbal reports, we should have to say that he didn't have the sensation of red, and therefore that we have refuted the theory that Q, the relevant qualitative character, is identical with the visual cortex property in question. This statement explores the implications of relying on verbal reports to determine the presence of a sensation, using it to question the identity theory that equates sensory experiences with specific brain properties. It highlights a critical flaw in linking subjective experiences directly to neurobiological events, emphasizing the limitations of verbal reports as definitive proof of sensory experiences. Quote 28. The difficulty is that there are identity theories which are observationally indistinguishable, by which I mean that they lead to the same predictions with respect to the experience of all observers in a normal condition. This quote addresses the challenge of differentiating between various identity theories when they are empirically indistinguishable in normal observational conditions. It points to a fundamental issue in the philosophy of mind, where theoretical distinctions may not translate into experiential or observable differences, casting doubt on the verifiability of these theories through conventional empirical means. Quote 29. It is tempting to take the same line with rationality itself, and to say that what determines whether a belief is rational is not the norms of rationality of this or that culture, but an ideal theory of rationality, a theory which would give necessary and sufficient conditions for a belief to be rational in the relevant circumstances in any possible world. This quote reflects on the nature of rationality, proposing that rather than being confined to cultural norms, rationality could ideally be understood through a universal theory that applies across all possible circumstances and worlds. It suggests an ambition to achieve a more objective and comprehensive understanding of what it means for a belief to be rational, transcending cultural and situational limitations. Quote 30. The problem is not without analogues in other areas. Some years ago, I studied the behavior of natural kind words, for example, gold, and I came to the conclusion that the extension of the term is not simply determined by a battery of semantical rules or other institutionalized norms. This quote delves into the complexities of language and categorization, using the term gold as an example to demonstrate that our understanding and classification of concepts are not rigidly fixed by predefined semantic rules or norms. It suggests that language is more flexible and context-dependent than rigid definitions can accommodate, indicating a dynamic interaction between our linguistic labels and the real world. Quote 31. Such a theory would have to account for the paradigmatic examples, as an ideal theory of gold accounts for the paradigmatic examples of gold. But it could go beyond them and provide criteria which would enable us to understand cases we cannot presently see to the bottom of, as our present theory of gold enables us to understand cases the most brilliant ancient Greek could not have understood. This quote expands on the previous idea by likening the theoretical understanding of rationality to our understanding of gold. It highlights the need for a theory that not only explains clear-cut cases, but also illuminates more ambiguous or complex instances that current perspectives do not fully resolve. The analogy with gold suggests that just as our scientific understanding of elements has progressed to explain phenomena previously incomprehensible, so too could our understanding of rationality evolve. Quote 32. Understood in a sufficiently wide sense, the topic of fact and value is a topic which is of concern to everyone. This quote underscores the universality and relevance of the distinction between facts and values, suggesting that, unlike more abstract philosophical debates, the implications of how we discern facts from values permeate everyday decision-making and ethical reasoning. It points to the intrinsic involvement of this distinction in the reflective considerations of any individual engaged with understanding the world and making judgments within it. Quote 33. The view that there is no fact of the matter as to whether or not things are good or bad or better or worse, etc., has, in a sense, become institutionalized. This quote critiques the widespread acceptance of the fact-value dichotomy, highlighting how deeply the separation between objective facts and subjective values is embedded in cultural and intellectual institutions. It challenges the notion that ethical judgments are devoid of factual content, suggesting that such a stark separation does not hold up under closer philosophical scrutiny. Quote 34. The strategy of my argument is not going to be a new one. I'm going to rehabilitate a somewhat discredited move in the debate about fact and value, namely, the move that consists in arguing that the distinction is at the very least hopelessly fuzzy because factual statements themselves and the practices of scientific inquiry upon which we rely to decide what is and what is not a fact presuppose values. Here, the quote introduces a critical examination of the fact-value distinction by asserting that even factual claims and scientific practices are underpinned by value judgments. This approach challenges the clear-cut separation between facts and values, arguing for a more intertwined relationship where values influence our understanding and classification of facts. Quote 35. The use of the word inconsiderate seems to me a very fine example of the way in which the fact-value distinction is hopelessly fuzzy in the real world and in the real language. This quote illustrates how terms commonly perceived as value-laden, such as inconsiderate, can simultaneously carry factual connotations, thus blurring the traditional philosophical distinction between facts and values. The explanation points to the inherent subjectivity and evaluative aspect in the language used to describe others, suggesting that our moral and factual judgments are deeply intertwined. Quote 36. Just as we criticize a describer who does not employ the concepts of table and chair when their use is called for, so also someone who fails to remark that someone is considerate or spontaneous may open himself to the criticism that he is imperceptive or superficial. His description is not an adequate one. This quote emphasizes the importance of employing appropriate concepts in descriptions to provide a complete and accurate portrayal of situations or characteristics. It argues that, just as it would be inadequate to describe a furnished room without mentioning tables and chairs, omitting relevant moral or character descriptors like considerate in a social context also results in an incomplete depiction, reflecting the speaker's lack of perception or depth. Quote 37. Let me go back and modify my previous example of the brain-in-a-vatists. This time, let us imagine that the continent of Australia is peopled by a culture which agrees with us on history, geography, and exact science, but which disagrees with us in ethics. This quote sets up a hypothetical scenario to explore how differing ethical beliefs can impact societal norms and interactions, despite a shared understanding of factual knowledge. It introduces the concept of super-Benthamites to examine the consequences of extreme utilitarian principles, highlighting how ethical divergences can fundamentally alter human interactions and societal structures. Quote 38. The same person who argues that ethical and political opinions are unverifiable argues with passion for his ethical and political opinions. This quote points out the contradiction inherent in the views of some who, despite claiming that ethical and political beliefs are inherently unverifiable and lack empirical foundation, will nonetheless defend their own beliefs with fervor. This underscores a common human inconsistency, where abstract philosophical skepticism about the nature of knowledge coexists with strong personal convictions in practice. Quote 39. Prejudice aside, pushpin is as good as poetry. By invoking Jeremy Bentham's controversial statement, this quote challenges the notion of inherent, objective value in cultural or intellectual pursuits compared to simpler pleasures. Bentham's perspective, radical for its time and still provocative today, posits that the value of activities, from the trivial to the culturally significant, is subjectively determined, rather than universally inherent, suggesting that value judgments are largely influenced by social and personal biases rather than objective criteria. Quote 40. If the discussion that we have reviewed, and it is a discussion that has been going on for many decades, seems inconclusive, it is perhaps because the discussion always assumes a kind of priority of rationality over goodness. This quote questions the traditional assumption that rationality inherently has precedence over ethical goodness in philosophical discourse. It suggests that many philosophical debates are inconclusive because they prioritize rational evaluation over moral considerations, highlighting a potentially flawed hierarchy in assessing value and ethical judgments. Quote 41. Let us recall that when Max Weber introduced the modern fact, value distinction, his argument against the objectivity of value judgments was precisely that it is not possible to establish the truth of a value judgment to the satisfaction of all possible rational persons. This statement refers to Max Weber's influential contribution to the fact-value distinction, arguing that value judgments lack objectivity because they cannot be universally validated among all rational individuals. This reflects a foundational challenge in philosophy and social science, questioning the universality and objectivity of ethical and value-based assertions. Quote 42. One reason for valuing rationality is obvious. Scientific rationality undeniably aids us in achieving various practical goals. This quote recognizes the utility of scientific rationality in facilitating practical achievements, acknowledging the instrumental value of rational approaches in science and technology. It underscores the tangible benefits of rationality in advancing technological progress and achieving specific outcomes in the modern world. Quote 43. The very rationality of science itself is sometimes thought to consist, or to consist in part, in the fact that at least the predictions of science can be publicly demonstrated, that everyone can be brought to agree that these results do obtain, that the phenomena predicted by the theory do occur. This statement explores the notion that the rationality of science is partly evidenced by its ability to produce publicly demonstrable predictions that achieve consensus among observers. It highlights a key aspect of scientific rationality: its capacity to generate verifiable and universally recognizable outcomes, reinforcing the empirical foundation of scientific inquiry. Quote 44. I argued in Chapter 6 that every fact is value-loaded, and every one of our values loads some fact. The argument in a nutshell was that fact, or truth, and rationality are interdependent notions. This quote underscores the interdependency of fact and value, arguing against the traditional dichotomy where facts are considered devoid of value judgments. It suggests that our perception of truth and rational belief are influenced by our values, meaning that what we consider rational or true inherently involves value judgments, thus challenging the notion of purely objective facts. Quote 45. A fact is something that it is rational to believe, or more precisely, the notion of a fact, or a true statement, is an idealization of the notion of a statement that it is rational to believe. Here, the quote elaborates on the previous point by defining a fact as something it is rational to believe, thus tying rationality directly to the concept of truth. It presents the idea that our understanding of what constitutes a fact is an idealized version of our broader understanding of rational acceptability, which is inherently value-laden. Quote 46. The decision that a picture of the world is true, or true by our present lights, or as true as anything is, and answers the relevant questions, as well as we are able to answer them, rests on and reveals our total system of value commitments. This quote further explores the role of values in shaping our understanding of truth, suggesting that our acceptance of any truth claim reflects and is contingent upon our underlying system of values. It implies that our entire worldview and the way we answer questions are deeply embedded with and influenced by our values, challenging the notion of an objective, value-free perspective. Quote 47. A being with no values would have no facts either. This quote emphasizes the interconnectedness of values and facts. It argues that our ability to recognize facts is inherently tied to our value system, implying that without values to guide relevance and significance, the concept of a fact loses its meaning. This suggests that the perception of facts is not a purely objective process, but is shaped by the values we hold. Quote 48. The choice of a conceptual scheme presupposes values, and the choice of a scheme for describing ordinary interpersonal relations and social facts, not to mention thinking about one's own life plan, involves, among other things, one's moral values. This quote asserts that our conceptual frameworks, used to describe the world and make sense of social interactions, are rooted in our values. It implies that how we understand interpersonal relations and navigate life decisions is intrinsically influenced by our moral compass, challenging the notion that one can adopt a purely objective conceptual scheme. Quote 49. Nothing about goodness not being a property follows from the fact that is good is used to commend. This quote challenges the idea that the use of moral language to express approval or commendation implies that moral properties do not exist. It suggests that the commendatory use of moral terms like good does not negate their role as descriptors of actual properties, thus defending the existence of moral properties beyond mere emotive expression. Quote 50. If one physicalistic property P were identical with moral rightness, or with epistemological justification, that would be queer. Queer for precisely the same reason that it would be queer if reference were a physicalistic relation. This quote addresses the issue of reducing moral properties to physical properties. It argues that identifying moral rightness or epistemological justification with a specific physical property is inherently strange because it conflicts with our understanding of nature as neutral, without inherent values or intentions. This queerness reflects the difficulty of reconciling moral and epistemological concepts with a purely physicalist ontology. Reason, Truth, and History by Hilary Putnam concludes by reinforcing his argument against metaphysical realism, emphasizing a more human-centered and pragmatic approach to understanding truth. He illustrates that while objective truths are meaningful, they are always understood through human conceptual frameworks. Putnam urges readers to recognize that rationality and truth are not detached from human interests and language, but are inherently connected to the practical ways in which we navigate and make sense of the world. This perspective aims to dissolve traditional philosophical dichotomies, offering a balanced view of objectivity that is free from metaphysical excesses.
Curious to dive into the mind of Hilary Putnam? With StudyLab Pro's book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of reason, truth, and history in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.